Steve Fuller has a great way of stealing my thunder. But that's okay. Because you were paying attention last week when we gathered for our adult ed program, which is, of course, a great advertisement. If you want to know more about the texts that we read, come to adult ed. We talk about these things. And last week, we were watching part of the video series with John Dominic Crossan, and he was talking about this Damascus Road experience that Paul had in the book of Acts. And Crossan, being the type of critical scholar that he is, looked at Luke's account in the book of Acts, and then the stories that Paul himself told about his experience of conversion. And Crossan suggests that probably the events in Jerusalem where Paul is commissioned by the high priest to go to Damascus and persecute these Christians, well, that those events are not historical. Or I believe Crossan says, no way. Paul, he says, was likely already in Damascus. It's where he was from, that general area of Tarsus. But regardless of whose story we want to hold, the story that Luke tells or the story that Paul tells in his own writings, this is the reading for today. And as a preacher, I always find that it's most helpful, instead of stopping and asking, well, did that happen, or is that just... is to take the text, to read it, and let the text speak to us, to tell us its own truth. And so for those of you who were in adult ed last week who are thinking, hold it, that's the thing that might not have happened, yes, it is. But it's the thing that Luke thought was important enough to craft as the foundational story for this apostle who was the one who went out to the Gentiles. So we find this interplay happening in Jerusalem where Saul is given the authority to go to Damascus, to round up those early Christians, and drag them back to Jerusalem in chains. In the book of Acts, he's making his way down the road with a whole retinue when suddenly there's a black light, and Paul falls to the ground. The medieval artists always have him on his back underneath his horse, though there's no horse in Acts. He falls to the ground and he hears the voice speaking, saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Saul, who we're to understand is a very zealous individual, who wants to do the right thing at all times, addresses this disembodied voice asking, who are you, Lord? Not Lord in the sense of God, but Lord in the sense of the one who holds power and authority. Because honestly, anyone who blinded you and cast you to the ground should probably show them some respect. Who are you, Lord? He asks. And the voice comes back to him. I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and go into the city, and you will be told what to do. So Saul, having this experience, being struck blind on the road to Damascus, gets, no doubt, holding on to the arm of someone else who leads him into the city. And there we'll pause Saul's story. We'll change the scene, and we'll look at Ananias. Ananias, the faithful person who had heard a bit of the Jesus story, who was an early convert to Christianity, who's praying, and he hears the voice of God speaking to him, telling him, "Get up, go to the street called Straight, and there you will find Saul in the house of Simon the tanner. Go and lay your hands upon him." And Ananias, just like you or I probably, hearing this command, responded, just like Moses did, "Here I am, send somebody else." Ananias, you see who Saul was. He heard stories of this super persecutor who was going after God's people. He didn't want to be in the same room with this Saul of Tarsus, much less be the one to bring him a gift of healing. But God compelled him. "Go, do what I've told you. Lay hands on Saul." And so we get back to Saul, sitting there having fasted for 3 days, praying and waiting for this Ananias to show up, because he too has heard the voice of God. Waiting and wondering who this Ananias would turn out to be. And when Ananias arrived, laid hands on him and healed him, scales fell from Paul's eyes. He turned to Ananias and asked to be baptized, asked to be included in this family of Christ, asked to be brought into this new covenant. And then Saul went out to the synagogues and began proclaiming that Jesus is the Son of God. It's 2 stories of transformation right there. Saul, as he's knocked down and blinded and changed, and Ananias as he's told to overcome his fear and prejudice. These 2 stories bring these 2 focal characters together and become the starting point for Saul, who became Paul, to share the gospel. We find in our other reading, the reading from John, the story of the post-resurrection Jesus walking on the beach by the Sea of Tiberias, and seeing his friends Peter and James and John out in boats fishing. It's a story that feels kind of familiar, just like that call story where he first encountered them and said, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." But this time, they're out and have had no luck, and he tells them, "Put your nets over on the other side of the boat," and this has happened before. And they drop the nets and they drag them up full of fish. Peter does the exact opposite of what you would expect. He puts on his clothes and jumps into the water, dog paddles his way to shore, and climbs out dripping, sitting there beside a charcoal fire, fish and bread. The other disciples make it to the shore, no doubt grumbling that Peter has just shirked. And they sit down together for a breakfast of fresh caught fish. And Jesus asks his friend, "Peter, do you love me?" Peter, who had denied even knowing Jesus, who had shed tears, says, "Lord, you know I love you." "Then feed my sheep," Jesus tells him. And I imagine Peter sitting there thinking, "What? Feed my sheep. Jesus doesn't have a flock. And just about the time that Peter is starting to realize that Jesus is crazy, Jesus asks him again, Peter, do you love me? Lord, you know I love you. Then tend my lambs. Peter, do you love me? Lord, you know everything. Why are you asking me this again? You know the answer to this question before you even ask it. Yes, I love you. Then feed my sheep. Who early on had been called to fish for people, who had followed Jesus for 3 years, who had seen him crucified and watched him as he appeared, raised again with holes in his hands and feet and a wound in his side, wasn't fishing for people. He was fishing for fish. Peter, take care of the flock, not the fish. And Peter had that moment of turning around. That moment of realizing that perhaps he had settled back into what was comfortable because it was easy and he wasn't doing the hard work that Christ had called him to tend the flock, to care for Christ's own people. Feed my sheep. We have stories of turning around today. Stories of Saul, when the scales fall from his eyes. Stories of Ananias, opening his eyes and his heart to go and risk carrying a persecutor. Scales fall away as well, but this is called to do something different. Called to tell a new truth. Called to turn. This week, we as Christians mourn the death of Rachel Held Evans. You may not even know her name, but those of us who day in and day out read what's going on in the world of Christianity know her well. She was only 37 years old when she passed away. But Rachel was an author and a blogger. She was a communicator. But what she communicated wasn't just a simple message of the gospel. It wasn't just stories of how to grow your church. It was the stories of her own turning. Rachel had begun life as a young evangelical, much as I did, and realized that that wasn't going to work for her. Realized that the message of the gospel was bigger than the culture wars that America's evangelical churches had been pushing for decades. In a column that was just printed in the New York Times this morning, it says, trying to end the church's culture wars, Rachel wanted to focus instead on building a new community among the church's refugees. Women who wanted to become ministers, gay Christians, and those who refused to choose between their intellectual integrity and their faith. Rachel turned. She sought new directions. She listened for God's leading and call, and she helped us all to see a little bit differently so that we could follow that call as well. She heard God asking, "Rachel, do you love me? Feed my sheep." And the sheep that she fed were those religious refugees, those who found they could no longer be comfortable or at home in the evangelicalism of the past, who were looking for a new future, who were seeking God's grace in new ways. I've gone through that turning. I hope many of you, actually, I hope all of you, have experienced a moment of turning. When the scales have fallen from your eyes, when you've realized that the ways that you have done things aren't working anymore, when you realize that God is calling you to something new, to a new way of being, to a new way of thinking, to a new form of service. Because God offers us those calls all the time. The scales fall from our eyes, and we see things differently. God calls us to go and serve even when we're saying, no, not to that Saul. God calls us to set aside our fishing nets and to pick up our shepherd's crooks. May you, may we, may all of us together open our eyes and our ears and our hearts to that transforming call, that not only the scales might fall from our eyes, but from our hearts, that we might be made new, that we might find God's power in service. May it be so.